We've been spending the last several weeks walking through the time in Old Testament and biblical history around the temple, the building of the temple, the exile from the temple, the destruction of the temple, and the coming back to the temple. We've been looking at the temple, its central role in worship, and noticing what people did when that central role of worship was removed from them or when they were removed from it. How did people react when the temple was destroyed? What did they do when they wanted to go about rebuilding the temple? And what was the role of the temple in the life of the faithful, in the life of believers? And so we've spent 4 weeks now going through this lesser known period of Old Testament history about the temple and the exile. So we've spent a lot of time on that, which might then surprise you to find out that the title of my sermon this morning is that the temple doesn't matter. The temple doesn't matter. I'm going to look really quickly at 3 reasons why the temple doesn't matter, and then where we're going to go from that. First of all, the temple doesn't matter because the temple wasn't permanent. The temple wasn't permanent. Thanks, I was still stuck there. In Mark chapter 13, Jesus was walking by the temple in Jerusalem while the temple was still standing. And as he was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." And Jesus says in response, "Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone will be left on another. Every stone is going to be thrown down." Jesus knew even in his time, while the temple was standing, that the temple wasn't permanent. We've seen some of this, but let me review just in case you've forgotten. So Israel at the height of their military and political and social powers around 930, 950, they built a temple, Solomon's temple. This is the Old Testament temple that they were so proud of. And it stood for a couple hundred years, but within 30 or 40 years, half of the people stopped using that temple because there had been a split in the country. And the temple was in the southern half of the country, and the people in the northern half weren't allowed to come down and use the temple. So even though they had this temple, it was only part of their national identity for a very short period of time. Only some of them got to use it. And then after about 250 years or so, that temple gets destroyed. Jerusalem is conquered and the temple gets destroyed. And so this building, this place that was the center of culture and religion and worship, social, economic hub, it gets destroyed. And after about 50 years of it being destroyed, people are allowed to go back and start rebuilding it. And we've seen some of the actions of Ezra and Nehemiah. We looked at the story of Esther that happens during that time. But one thing that's obvious is that the temple isn't permanent, right? And it was always at the whim of whatever military powers happened to be there at the time. First, the Israelites were the power, and then the Assyrians came in and took them out of power, and then the Babylonians came in and took them out of power, and then the Persians came in and took them out of power, and then the Alexander the Great and the Greeks came in, and then the Seleucids came in, and then the Romans came in and occupied this land, and they dictated whether or not the temple would stand or whether or not the temple would fall. They dictated who could be allowed in the temple or whether or not the temple was allowed to function at all. It was never permanent. Even in the Old Testament, even in the heyday of the temple was never permanent. And Jesus knew that, even while the second temple was still standing. Solomon's temple was built around 950. It was destroyed around 586. It was rebuilt around 520, and that smaller temple lasted through Jesus' time. But even Jesus in his time knew that it was going to be destroyed again because it wasn't permanent. And 30 or 40 years after Jesus' death, it was, in fact, destroyed again, never to have been rebuilt. The temple isn't permanent. Here's the second thing that we can learn after 4 weeks of tracing the story of the temple, is that the temple isn't the point. The temple isn't the point. In John chapter 4, Jesus again is talking, and this time he's talking to a woman from that northern area who had a different temple. Remember when I said the north and the south split, the people from the north no longer had access to the temple. So what do? They built their own temple and said, that's the temple that we're supposed to be worshiping on. So how important could the one temple have been if it can be so easily replaced by another temple? But Jesus runs into this woman from Samaria, and she says to Jesus, our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place that we must worship is in Jerusalem. And Jesus said, woman, believe me, a time is coming, and now is, when neither you will worship in this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you don't know, but we in Jerusalem, we know what we are worshiping, because salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and now has come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For these are the kind of worshipers that God seeks. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. What's the point of all of that? They're having this conversation. This woman from the north, there was a temple in the north, and Jesus from the south, and there's a temple in the south, and they're discussing which temple is the right one. And Jesus is saying the temple isn't the point. A day is going to be coming, and in fact, Jesus says his presence ushers in that day, where you worship, which of those temples isn't the point, because it's not about the location, it's not about the geography, it's not about the ethnicity. It's about worshiping Jesus in spirit, worshiping God in spirit and truth. God isn't tied to a building. God isn't tied to a particular people group. After this, around the time of Alexander the Great, about 350 years before Jesus Christ, they built this temple to replace the old temple that they no longer had access to. So neither one of them actually had the exclusive temple. They were both operating out of temples, but both of them were operating only if the military and political powers around them allowed them to operate. So not only was the temple obviously not permanent, but the temple wasn't even the point. Jesus said something bigger, something better than the temple is coming. We're going to investigate that in a second, but whatever it was the temple was meant to do, something better is coming. Something better has come to do what the temple wanted to do, but couldn't do because it was impermanent, because the place was not the point. And in fact, that leads us to the third thing, which is in fact the temple has been replaced. The temple was always going to be replaced. Now, to understand what comes next, I have to just give you a little bit more temple background. The temple existed at its biggest level so that people could connect with God. That was why the temple was there. So when they built the temple, it had different rooms and stages and areas. And there was a general area just where anybody could go. And then there was a more exclusive area where only Jewish men could go. And then there was a place for rabbis and teachers. And then there was just one place, the Holy of Holies, this small square that only one person could go to only one time a year, and that was to offer sacrifices on behalf of all the people. No one else was allowed to go in it. And it was separated from the rest of the temple by a big curtain, not maybe unlike the curtain that we have in our baptistry, much thicker, much bigger, much higher. But this marked that you could not get in there because this was where the Ark of the Covenant was. This is where the presence of God was said to dwell. And you just can't go into the presence of God. He is too holy. You will not be able to withstand it. You will be judged and you will be found falling short. And so only the high priest could go into this area, and the high priest could only go into it once a year, and the high priest could only go into it after he had gone through a bunch of personal cleansing rituals so that he would be in there sinless. And then he would go in there and offer sacrifices on behalf of the people. And that curtain represented this barrier between people and God, between all of the sinners and the approach to God with the sacrifice that they needed for those sins. And so it's in that context with that temple structure and with that curtain separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple and from all of the people, that Jesus, when he was hanging on the cross, this is what we're told happens. When Jesus cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit, and at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Matthew mentions this. Mark mentions this. Luke mentions this. What is so important about this that all three of the gospel writers here mention it? It's just a structural malfunction, isn't it? No, it isn't. There's a reason. There's so much more going on here. If that curtain represents, as it does, the barrier between God and people, the death of Jesus Christ has torn down the barrier that keeps people from the God that they need. There's something symbolic happening in that temple curtain being torn, but it represents something actual that Jesus did in Jesus' death and in his resurrection. Access to God is now possible for everybody. It's not exclusive. It's not a one-time-a-year thing. Whatever the temple was meant to do, Jesus did it in a greater way. Jesus is a greater temple. Jesus says that about himself in the book of Matthew. He is a greater temple. If the temple is meant to show the presence of God in the world, the presence of God dwelling among his people, Jesus is doing that in an even greater way. If the temple is meant to exist to be the place that draws the believers of God together as one body, Jesus Christ does that in even a greater way. If the temple is meant to be the place where acceptable sacrifices for sin are offered to God so that people can be restored in their relationship to God, then Jesus is the greater sacrifice. He's the greater altar. He tears down that wall and makes salvation available for everybody. Jesus is that temple. Jesus accomplishes whatever the temple was meant to accomplish. And in fact, Jesus does so permanently and perfectly what the original temples could only do temporarily, that when time is up, when this world is done, when we've passed into eternity, in the book of Revelation describing the end of time, we're told that when John has this vision of eternity, he doesn't see a temple. There's no temple there. Why? Because God and Jesus Christ are the temple. Whatever was meant to be accomplished by the temple is accomplished by Jesus Christ. And this is why I'm saying the temple isn't a big deal. The temple, the only way that the temple is a big deal is that it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't meant to be permanent. It wasn't meant to be the solution. It wasn't meant to be the answer. Whatever it was and whatever it was meant to express represented something that has been fulfilled more fully with the coming of Jesus Christ. As long as the offerings of sacrifices were dependent on a time and on a place, they were in jeopardy. They were in jeopardy if the building got destroyed. Connection with God was in danger if people didn't observe the rituals of approach properly or if the land was overrun by invaders. As long as connecting to God was tied to a time and a place, circumstances could conspire to keep people away from that time and that place. We've experienced that. We've experienced that with sickness, with weather, famine. So many things could keep people from offering the sacrifices that needed to be offered, from finding the forgiveness that they needed to find, from connecting with God. Political fortunes rise and fall, and as they do, people's access to the temple rose and fell. The existence of the temple itself, rose and fell, depending on whether the political powers that be let it be there or not. The situation was never permanent. It was never complete. It was never sure. It was always in danger. And that is why the temple itself was no big deal. But then Jesus burst on the scene. After the temple existed to show us what needed to be accomplished for us to be right with God, Jesus comes on the scene. An altar that can't be torn down. He is a temple that cannot be shaken. He is a sacrifice that cannot be compromised and does not have to be repeated, and is never in danger of being outdone or overruled. A kingdom that isn't limited to time or place. Get this. Jesus proves that the brokenness of the world is not decisive. Jesus proves that the brokenness of the world is not decisive. The people in the time and the place of the temple, who could worship or not, depending on what was happening around them, were at the mercy of the world, were at the mercy of those circumstances. But Jesus, because he's greater, proves that the brokenness of the world, no matter what condition the world is in, that is not the decisive factor in whether or not you can connect with God, whether or not you can be sure that there's an offering on your behalf acceptable to God. The brokenness of the world is not decisive. If identity and standing and connection with God were based on the viability of the physical temple, then a lot of the time, a lot of the people were in a lot of trouble. And if our identity today is based on standing, on our identity or a standing or a connection with God that's based on any kind of a structure, a physical structure, or more likely in our days, a metaphorical structure, we are in trouble. It's the enduring work of Christ that matters. The brokenness and the impermanence of the world is the very reason we need something other than the temple. We have a better temple. The temple was about access and acceptance and the presence of God, and we have all of that through Jesus Christ. And it's not something that we can create on our own, whether it's in the structure of a building or in anything else. Powers rise and fall. A few minutes ago, I said that first it was the Israelites, then it was the Assyrians, then it was the Babylonians, then it was the Persians, and then it was the Greeks, and then it was the Seleucids, and then it was the Romans, and some of you thought, I don't know what the Seleucids are. How many of you have ever been to Ancestry.com or any one of those family DNA tree sites? How many of you have come back with at least 2% Seleucid? Nobody. The Seleucids ran the world, this part of the world, for 250 years. They were in unquestioned control of the land, including the land of the temple. We've never heard of them. They mean nothing to us. They don't exist in any meaningful way to us anymore. And yet they were the military power of the world for longer than the United States has been a country. That's how precarious power, access, built on human situations, human circumstances is. It can rise and fall in a way that we can't believe, that we can't deal with. But Jesus coming removes all of that. Now, I say all this to make this point. I'm going to put this up and then I'm going to try to explain to you what I mean by it. In the pursuit of Christ, temples are established. In the pursuit of temples, Christ gets lost. In the pursuit of Christ, temples are established. In the pursuit of temples, Christ gets lost. Let me leave this up there where I tell you a story about a time in Old Testament history when the temple was still standing, the first temple, Solomon's temple. And this is about 622 years before Jesus Christ. So the temple had been in existence about 300 years. The nations had split about 250 years ago, so just the southern part of Jerusalem in Judah was using the temple. But the temple was there, the temple was built. And then there's a story in 2 Kings chapter 22 where there's a king, a good king, a believing king. His name is Josiah. And he's overseeing work on the temple. So he's got people assigned to, there's people greeting you at the door, taking your temperature when you're coming in, can give you a mask. And there's people that have the hand sanitizer, and then there's people doing work in the temple 600 years before Christ. And all these things are happening. People are doing work. They're cleaning out crawl spaces and storage areas. And someone in the course of cleaning out, and this is all in 2 Kings chapter 22, you can look it up, in the course of cleaning out the church, do you know what they found? A Bible. They found the law. They found the writings of Moses. It had been stuffed away in some storage room for so long that no one was exactly sure what it was. And they brought it to the king, and the king brought it to the priests, and the priests brought it to their counselors, because they all wanted to figure out what it was that was being said in here. The temple was standing, and yet the purpose of the temple wasn't being pursued. They had completely lost track of what it was they existed to do. The temple still stood, but they had lost track of what they were supposed to be doing. Could you imagine us as a church if you came in after we were away for 3 months or so, and then we came back in and we were singing, but it wasn't about God or Jesus, it was just other songs, and I came up here and I gave you 4 points to financial freedom, or 7 ways to be a better sister-in-law to your dentist's cousin, or whatever topical sermon we might want to come up with, but we forgot about the Bible, we forgot about the point. The building could still be here, but so what if we're not pursuing what it is we're supposed to pursue? We are living in a broken world. That the world is broken is not new to us, but the evidence of the brokenness of the world seems more and more manifest lately. And we see that the world is searching for something. And so there's a couple of things that we can do here. We can pursue temples, by which I mean structures that are meant to provide us security and safety and power. And I'm talking metaphorically. So maybe you build a temple in your life, same way I'm tempted to build a temple in my life, by a dollar sign with a series of numbers after it. I'm going to be secure because I'm going to build up savings. I'm going to prepare myself. I'm going to insulate myself. Maybe you're going to build up meaning for yourself, a structure for yourself, protection for yourself through some kind of a social cause or movement. And that's where you're going to find your identity. But all of us are going to build some kind of a temple, some kind of a structure, some kind of a system that we mean to exist to keep us safe and protected. But as Christians, if we build those systems, economic systems, military systems, social systems, but we do so to the exclusion of pursuing Christ, those kind of systems are going to become just as impermanent and just as susceptible to decay as the Old Testament temple was. Those structures are only going to be good as long as the people in power say those structures are going to be okay. And then those structures are going to be gone. And we will be just like the people of the Old Testament times 2,500 years ago, dependent on the society and the circumstances around us. And if we build temples like that, we will, just like they did in Josiah's time, lose sight of their purpose, whether or not the building stands or not. But if in our lives as Christians, as a church, as Windy City Community Church, as the church, the worldwide church, if we pursue Christ, if we pursue going after Christ, His values, what's important to Him, and in the course of pursuing Christ, we will establish temples of justice, temples of fairness, temples of equality, things that come up that spur from our pursuit of Christ. But if we pursue those as temples in and of ourselves, economic, whatever they are, we will lose sight on what our purpose is. Church, our purpose is to accept and then pursue and model Christ to the world. If we're not doing that, who is going to? Temporary temples of social and political and military and societal powers will rise up, and they will provide a moment's safety or a moment's power, but they will fade. And as Christians, our goal is to pursue Christ, talk about Christ, model Christ, and in doing that, all sorts of good structures will be established. But if establishing some security in our lives that falls short of it being based on Jesus Christ is our goal, we will be disappointed. It will crumble. It will fall. Political powers, military powers, looking at the Old Testament temple times for 4 or 5 weeks has taught us anything, is it's that they crumble, that they fall, they are unreliable. Things that people could not have imagined. The Seleucids, in the middle of the Seleucid dynasty, felt as safe and secure as we do, probably more so. And you know what? Before them, so did the Greeks. Alexander the Great conquered the world. And he was only in power for 13 years, and after he died, his kingdom fell apart. Israelites, they thought they were going to rule forever. And then the Assyrians had something to say about that, and they thought they were going to rule forever until the Babylonians had something to say about that. And the Babylonians were pretty sure they were going to rule forever until the Persians came and said something about that. Until you get all the way to Jesus' time, and the Romans owned everything. And the Romans were in charge. And during none of those periods of power did anyone think anything was ever going to happen. They could only envision a world where they would be in power. And yet, as those dynasties, as those powers, as those movements rise and fall, the Word of God remains a constant. The work of God in the world remains a constant. All these tutorials of the temple that lead us to Jesus Christ, the real place of sacrifice, the real place of salvation, the real place of meaning. And now, even as in the 2,000 years after Jesus Christ, as the world rises and falls, and now, at least for the moment, the United States takes its turn at or near the top of the pecking order, that too will pass. And if our confidence, if our security is based in anything, whether it's in the stock market, or whether it's based in our military might, or whether it's based in a political power, or any other kind of movement that we think is going to give us security, it might for an instant, but it will prove to be no more than the temple. We, as people who know Christ, need to be the ones who are talking about Christ. We need to be the ones that are leading people to Christ. And when we see the world around us, and when we see the country around us trying to build these other structures of security, these other temples, we can understand because we've done it ourselves. But we also have the honor and the obligation to point them to the place of true security, of true safety, of true permanence. And that is the person and work of Jesus Christ. That is our job in a broken, chaotic world. Our job is to pursue Christ and watch the good things that happen around that. Because if we pursue anything lesser than Christ for our security and for our safety, we will lose track of Christ. I want you to do something for me as we close. I want you just to close your eyes. Even watching at home, take the minute and close your eyes, because I want you just to think and not be distracted by the stuff around you. I can ask you this comfortably because we've all done it. Where is your security? What are you hoping in? What are you confident in that's going to protect you? Where does your hope and trust truly lie? Is it in money? Is it in health? Is it in politics? Is it in some aspect of society? What is really your hope for your best life and for the best possible world that you can imagine? Where is that hope? If you're not sure, I'll give you a hint. The thing that you go to bed thinking about at night, the thing that you wake up thinking about in the morning, the thing that you worry about the most, that's it. What is yours? And understand with me that anything a part of the work of Christ is going to be like the temples, temporary. Well-meaning, good-intentioned, absolutely. Permanent? Absolutely not. Only Christ, the work that Christ has done, can redeem the world and the people in it. That's it. And along the way to pursuing Christ, all sorts of things will happen. We will do all sorts of things that will make this world a better place. And will cause the rise of useful structures that pursue honesty and value of all people. But true meaning, deep spiritual fulfillment can only come through what Jesus Christ provides. And if 1,000 years of temple history teach us nothing else, let it teach us that Jesus Christ is the purpose, he's the meaning, he's the structure, he's the safety. He's the only way that the world and the people in it can be saved. We know that message. If you have believed in Jesus Christ, you've been saved by that message. And it's our job to carry that message to a world that needs it. God, thank you for this word. Thank you for the story and the history of your people in it. Thank you that we are among those people who are called to proclaim your name. God, show us how to pursue you for the good of all those around us. God, thank you for the permanence and the deliverance that comes in Jesus Christ. I pray you'd keep us from being distracted by anything else that tempts us to find our security or our meaning or our purpose. Anything that is less than knowing you through Jesus Christ. And knowing you through Jesus Christ, as we do, let us endeavor to bring the world to that same saving knowledge. Whether that's proclaiming the gospel, whether it's acts of kindness and mercy and justice. Help us to be the people that Christ has called us to be. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Just a couple of things before we let you go here. First of all, we're glad you joined us, whether you came into the room or whether you're joining us online. We really appreciate that. For those of you who are here, if you're so inclined, there's an offering plate at each door if you want, as you're going out. If you'd like to contribute, for those of you who are online, you can contribute in the normal ways that we do that. We also want to remind you of the couple of things that are coming up this week on Zoom. We have our Wednesday night Bible study, as we have been having, and Pastor Adeline has her Thursday afternoon Bible study on Zoom, so you should have gotten an email, and you will get another one that has links to that. There's also something else that's interesting that you might have missed that I want to make sure I point out to you, is that Jacqueline is leading a virtual bingo this week, and that's hard to explain, but let me try. So if you haven't gotten it, you will get an email, and you will have a printable bingo card there. But instead of it having numbers or letters or anything like that, what it's going to have is events to do. The goal is to give you stuff to do with your family, and you want to try to accomplish 5 in a row. And we're doing this in conjunction with a bunch of other churches, and there's prizes for doing it. So you'll get a bingo card, and you print it out, and it might say something like, set up a slip and slide in your house or in your kitchen, and film yourself. Take a picture of your family doing that. Send that in, cross off that one. What's the next one on that diagonal? Oh, maybe it's go to the church and draw a chalk painting on the sidewalk. This is something for you to do with your family or your grandkids or something like that, to get involved and be connected. And then you can check that one off. One of the squares I know is write a letter of encouragement to someone in your church who's important to you, maybe a Sunday school teacher or an Awana leader, someone that has served you. Write them a letter of encouragement, send that off and check it off, and there will be prizes for the people who win. So that's just a way to get you connected, to do something fun maybe with some of your families in still a socially conscious, socially distancing way. As for the other stuff, check us online, look for those things. I'm going to be jumping down right after this and going to the Coffee Connect. So those of you online, if you want to join me for that, we'd love to have you. For all of us, though, whether at home and online, this week there's going to be a lot of things thrown at us. Some of them we're expecting, and some of them we're not. But no matter what happens as we go through this week, let's not forget that we have a God is with us every step that we take. So live love. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.